Sarah Jenkins lived a life that could be described as unremarkable by most standards. She was a modest woman in her early 40s, soft-spoken yet resilient, and well-loved by those who truly knew her. In the small, picturesque town of Brookhaven, where everyone's business seemed to be public knowledge, Sarah was a rare enigma. She had a presence that hinted at untold stories but a demeanor that discouraged prying questions. To most, she was simply the nice lady who baked pies for the church fundraiser, living a quiet life with her husband, David. That morning started like any other for Sarah. The autumn air was crisp, leaves painted in shades of amber and crimson, as she stepped out of her home to run errands. One stop on her list was the firehouse, a building as iconic in Brookhaven as its century-old clock tower. A few days earlier, a small incident at her neighbor's property had revealed an unsettling reality. Some of the firefighters had neglected their duties, arriving late and dismissive to a call about a chimney fire. Her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, had expressed her frustration to Sarah, who promised to bring it up with the fire chief during her next visit to town. It wasn't in Sarah's nature to let such things slide. As she approached the firehouse, Sarah noticed the unmistakable sounds of boisterous laughter echoing from inside. The building, with its red brick facade and old wooden doors, seemed almost alive with the energy of the men who worked there. Sarah hesitated briefly before stepping in. She had no illusions about the culture of the place. Brookhaven's firehouse had earned a reputation not just for its heroics but also for its cliquish, sometimes juvenile, behavior. The firefighters were local celebrities of sorts, revered by some, tolerated by others. Inside, the scene was typical: a few men playing cards at a table, another reclining with a newspaper, and a couple tinkering with equipment in the corner. The air smelled faintly of smoke and coffee. Sarah cleared her throat politely, drawing the attention of a man at the card table. He was burly, with a thick mustache and a commanding presence. "Can we help you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone laced with mild condescension. It was clear he didn't recognize Sarah. "Yes, I'm here to speak with the chief about an incident involving Mrs. Caldwell on Maple Street last week," Sarah replied, her voice steady. Her mention of the incident drew smirks and exchanged glances among the men. One of them muttered something under his breath that elicited a chuckle from the group. Sarah ignored it and stood her ground. "Well, the chief's not here right now," the mustached man said. "But I can take a message, or you can try coming back later." "Thank you, but I'd prefer to address this in person," Sarah said, her tone polite but firm. She turned to leave, but as she reached the door, one of the younger firefighters couldn't resist making a comment. By the time Sarah reached her home, the weight of the morning's confrontation had begun to settle on her shoulders. She knew how small towns like Brookhaven operated: nothing stayed private for long. True to form, by the time the afternoon sun had dipped low, whispers of her fiery exchange with the firefighters were already circulating among the locals. At the grocery store, Mrs. Caldwell herself had heard the story, though, in her version, Sarah had stormed into the firehouse with an army of lawyers and delivered a scathing speech that left the men quaking in their boots. "Sarah Jenkins, I heard you put those boys at the firehouse in their place," Mrs. Caldwell exclaimed when she saw Sarah in the produce aisle. Her voice, though warm, carried the kind of volume that ensured half the store would hear her. "Not quite as dramatic as all that," Sarah replied, forcing a smile. "I just asked them to be a bit more professional. That's all." Mrs. Caldwell chuckled knowingly. "Well, they needed to hear it. Good for you, dear. Someone ought to hold them accountable." Sarah nodded politely, though the attention made her uneasy. As more people overheard and joined the conversation, she realized the story was growing legs. By the time she left the store, she overheard a passerby telling someone that she had threatened to shut the firehouse down entirely. Meanwhile, back at the firehouse, the men were still stewing over the morning's events. It wasn't just Sarah's words that had unsettled them, it was the way she had said them, the quiet confidence that hinted she wasn't someone to be trifled with. "I don't get it," one of the younger firefighters, Mike, said as he leaned against the counter in the break room. "She didn't look like anyone important. Who is she to talk to us like that?" "I don't know," said Carl, the mustached veteran, his tone cautious. "But I've been around long enough to know when someone's holding cards they haven't shown yet. There's more to her than meets the eye." The others laughed it off, dismissing Carl's unease as paranoia. But Carl wasn't so sure. He had spent years in the fire service, dealing with all kinds of people, and Sarah's demeanor didn't fit the mold of someone simply venting frustration. There was a purpose behind her actions, and it left him with an unsettled feeling. Later that evening, Sarah sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea and scrolling through her phone. As expected, social media was abuzz with posts about her visit to the firehouse. Some people praised her for speaking out, while others criticized her for overstepping. "Who does she think she is, lecturing the firehouse?" one post read. Another replied, "Good for her. Those guys have been getting away with too much for too long." David walked into the room, his tie loosened and his face weary from a long day of meetings. He glanced at Sarah and immediately picked up on her tension. "Rough day?" he asked, setting his briefcase on the counter. "You could say that," Sarah replied, giving him a brief rundown of her encounter with the firefighters. David listened intently, his brow furrowing as she spoke. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "And they don't know who you are?" he asked. "No," Sarah said. "And I'd prefer it stays that way for now. This isn't about you or your position, it's about holding them accountable as individuals." David nodded thoughtfully. "I get that. But you know this is going to spiral, right? People are already talking. It won't be long before someone makes the connection." Sarah sighed, knowing he was right. "I just couldn't stand there and let them treat me, or Mrs. Caldwell, for that matter, like we don't matter. If they act like this toward me, imagine how they treat others who can't speak up for themselves." David reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm proud of you," he said. "But be careful. Not everyone is going to see this the way you do." As the days passed, the story continued to snowball. The town's rumor mill churned out increasingly sensationalized versions of Sarah's confrontation, and local media outlets caught wind of the drama. A small-town newspaper ran a headline that read, "Firehouse Feud, Local Woman Takes on Brookhaven's Bravest." The article painted Sarah as a bold whistleblower, though it also quoted unnamed sources who dismissed her as a meddling troublemaker. At the same time, whispers began to circulate about Sarah's husband. Brookhaven wasn't a place where state politics often made headlines, so many people were unaware of David Jenkins' position as governor. But a few observant residents started to put two and two together. "Did you hear who her husband is?" a patron at the local diner asked one morning over coffee. "The governor. No wonder she had the guts to stand up to those guys." By the end of the week, the connection between Sarah and David was common knowledge. The tone of the town's chatter shifted dramatically. Some people were outraged, accusing Sarah of using her husband's influence to intimidate the firehouse. Others applauded her even more fervently, arguing that her actions highlighted the need for reform in public institutions. The firefighters, meanwhile, found themselves under a microscope. Carl, who had been wary from the start, felt vindicated. "I told you she wasn't just some random lady," he said to Mike. "We might have poked a bear without realizing it." Mike, however, was defensive. "So what if her husband's the governor? That doesn't give her the right to come in here and act like she owns the place." But not all of the firefighters shared Mike's defiance. A younger recruit, Tom, began to feel conflicted. He had joined the fire service to make a difference, but the culture at the firehouse had often left him disillusioned. Sarah's confrontation had struck a chord with him, forcing him to question whether he had been complicit in the very behavior he despised. As tension simmered, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. She hadn't intended to spark such widespread controversy, but now that the issue was out in the open, she felt a responsibility to see it through. She began to quietly gather information, speaking to other residents who had grievances with the firehouse. What she uncovered shocked her, a pattern of negligence, arrogance, and even outright misconduct that had been swept under the rug for years. Armed with this knowledge, Sarah knew she couldn't back down. But she also knew that the battle ahead would be far more challenging than she had anticipated. The firefighters weren't just individuals, they were symbols of the town's identity, and taking them on meant taking on a deeply ingrained culture. As the sun set on Brookhaven that night, the town was abuzz with speculation and tension. And in the quiet of her home, Sarah steeled herself for the storm that was about to break. The fallout from Sarah's confrontation with the firefighters continued to ripple through Brookhaven. As the days passed, the tension in the town thickened. Sarah had hoped the issue would spark a constructive dialogue, but instead, it seemed to have drawn a sharp line down the middle of the community. On one side were those who supported her, praising her courage to speak out against perceived arrogance and negligence. On the other side were those who viewed her as a troublemaker, accusing her of dragging her husband's political influence into small-town affairs. At the firehouse, the atmosphere was tense. The firefighters, once the undisputed heroes of Brookhaven, now found themselves under scrutiny. Their reputation, carefully cultivated through years of community service, was being questioned. Carl, the mustached veteran, tried to rally his team, insisting they needed to present a united front. "We've faced fires bigger than this," he told the group during a team meeting. "We stick together, and we'll get through it." But not everyone shared Carl's resolve. Tom, the young recruit who had been quietly wrestling with his own doubts, couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Sarah had a point. The culture at the firehouse had long been one of unchecked bravado, and while he admired the courage and dedication of his colleagues, he also recognized their flaws. The incident with Mrs. Caldwell wasn't the first time they dismissed a call as unimportant, and it wouldn't be the last unless something changed. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast the firehouse in an amber glow, Tom approached Carl in the garage. The older firefighter was inspecting equipment, his expression distant. "Carl," Tom began hesitantly, "can I talk to you for a minute?" Carl looked up, his gaze softening when he saw the younger man's serious expression. "Sure, kid. What's on your mind?" Tom hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Do you ever think, maybe we could be doing things differently? You know, being more respectful, taking every call seriously?" Carl straightened, his brows furrowing. "What are you getting at?" "It's just..." "Sarah Jenkins," Tom said, lowering his voice as though the walls themselves might be listening. "She's not wrong. I mean, look at what happened with Mrs. Caldwell. That could have been a real disaster. And we just laughed it off." Carl sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't lose sleep over the calls we don't take seriously? But this job, it changes you. You see so much, and after a while, you build walls. It's not right, but it's how some of us cope." Tom nodded, appreciating Carl's honesty but still feeling unsettled. Maybe it's time to start breaking those walls down. Carl didn't reply immediately. Instead, he looked out the window, where the first stars of the evening were beginning to appear. "Maybe," he said finally. "But change doesn't come easy in a place like this." While the firefighters grappled with their internal conflicts, Sarah was quietly laying the groundwork for what she hoped would be a turning point. After her initial confrontation at the firehouse, she had spent days speaking to residents, collecting stories of neglect, and documenting patterns of behavior that pointed to systemic issues. She compiled her findings into a detailed report, one that she planned to present at the next town hall meeting. The day of the meeting arrived, and Brookhaven's community center was packed. The air buzzed with anticipation and unease. Sarah sat near the front, her report tucked neatly into a folder on her lap. David sat beside her, his presence understated but supportive. Though he had initially urged her to be cautious, he now understood the depth of her conviction and the importance of her cause. As the meeting began, the mayor called for public comments, and Sarah stood. The room fell silent as she walked to the podium, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before she began. "Good evening," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "I'm here tonight because I believe in this town and the people who live here. Brookhaven is a community built on trust, on neighbors helping neighbors, and on holding each other accountable when we fall short of those ideals." She paused, scanning the room. She could see familiar faces, some supportive, others skeptical. "In recent weeks, I've had conversations with many of you," she continued. "What I've heard has been both heartbreaking and inspiring. Heartbreaking because of the stories of neglect and disrespect that have come to light. Inspiring because so many of you want to see change, to see Brookhaven live up to its potential as a community that values every resident." Sarah went on to detail the incidents she had uncovered, carefully balancing her criticism with a recognition of the firehouse's contributions to the town. She emphasized the need for reform, not retribution, and called for an independent review of the firehouse's operations. Her words were measured but powerful, and by the time she finished, the room was abuzz with murmurs. But not everyone was swayed. As Sarah returned to her seat, a man in the back stood, his voice booming. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. "The firehouse has been the backbone of this town for generations. They don't need some outsider telling them how to do their jobs." Sarah felt a wave of anger rise within her, but before she could respond, another voice spoke up. It was Mrs. Caldwell, her frail frame standing tall as she addressed the room. "She's not an outsider," Mrs. Caldwell said firmly. "She's one of us. And she's right. If we don't hold each other accountable, who will?" The room erupted into a mix of applause and heated debate. The meeting stretched late into the night, with voices on both sides passionately making their cases. By the end, the town council agreed to establish a committee to review the firehouse's practices, a small but significant victory for Sarah. As Sarah and David walked home that night, the cool air bracing against their skin, she felt a mixture of relief and trepidation. The battle was far from over, but she had taken the first step. "What you did tonight," David said, breaking the silence, "it took courage." Sarah smiled faintly. "I just hope it's enough." In the days that followed, Brookhaven began to shift. The firefighters, now under scrutiny, found themselves re-evaluating their attitudes and actions. Carl, inspired by his conversation with Tom, took it upon himself to address the team, urging them to embrace the changes coming their way. And Tom, emboldened by Sarah's example, began to advocate for a culture of respect and accountability within the firehouse. For Sarah, the journey was just beginning. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, but she also knew she wasn't alone. Brookhaven was a town of ordinary people capable of extraordinary change, and Sarah was determined to be a part of that transformation. The days following the town hall meeting brought a mixture of progress and pushback. Sarah's proposal to form an independent review committee had been accepted, but it quickly became clear that implementing real change would be far from straightforward. The committee, made up of town council members, local residents, and a few outside consultants, was tasked with evaluating the firehouse's practices and addressing the concerns Sarah had raised. However, the very existence of the committee sparked a new wave of controversy, with some residents accusing Sarah of overstepping her bounds and others viewing the move as a long overdue reckoning. At the firehouse, the tension was palpable. Carl had managed to convince most of the crew to approach the review process with an open mind, but resistance still lingered. Mike, the young firefighter who had been vocal in his opposition to Sarah's criticism, was especially bitter. "This whole thing is a witch hunt," Mike grumbled one afternoon as he leaned against the engine. We bust our backs for this town, and this is the thanks we get? A bunch of outsiders poking around, telling us how to do our jobs? Carl, standing nearby, let out a sigh. It's not about telling us how to do our jobs, Mike. It's about making sure we're doing them the right way. No one's perfect, and if there's room for improvement, we owe it to this town to take that seriously. Mike scoffed. Yeah, well, I don't see Sarah Jenkins running into burning buildings. Easy for her to criticize from the sidelines. Tom, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. She's not trying to take anything away from us. She's just asking us to be better. Don't you think that's worth considering? Mike shot him a glare but didn't respond. The conversation left a heavy silence hanging in the air, one that mirrored the growing divide within the team. Meanwhile, Sarah was facing her own challenges. The decision to step into the spotlight had turned her life upside down. She couldn't go anywhere in Brookhaven without drawing attention, and not all of it was positive. At the coffee shop, a woman she'd known for years refused to meet her eye. At the post office, a man muttered something under his breath as she walked past. Even some of her friends seemed to be keeping their distance, unsure how to navigate the sudden controversy surrounding her. Despite the isolation, Sarah remained steadfast. She threw herself into the work of the committee, attending every meeting, poring over reports, and listening to the stories of residents who had been affected by the firehouse's shortcomings. Each story strengthened her resolve, reminding her why she had taken up this fight in the first place. One evening, as Sarah sat at her kitchen table reviewing notes for an upcoming committee presentation, David walked in, his expression a mix of pride and concern. "You've been at this all day," he said, setting down a cup of tea in front of her. "You need a break." Sarah looked up, exhaustion etched into her face. "I can't, David. There's too much at stake." "I know," he said gently. "But you're not in this alone. Remember that." His words were a balm to her frayed nerves, a reminder that she didn't have to carry the burden entirely on her own. Together, they talked late into the night, brainstorming ways to address the resistance she was facing and strategizing how to build broader support for the committee's work. As the weeks passed, small victories began to emerge. The committee's initial findings revealed significant gaps in training and oversight at the firehouse, prompting the town council to approve funding for additional resources and mandatory workshops on professionalism and community engagement. These changes, though incremental, were a step in the right direction. But just as things seemed to be moving forward, an unexpected twist threatened to derail everything. Late one evening, Sarah received an anonymous letter in the mail. The envelope was plain and unmarked, and inside was a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "Stop digging. Some things are better left buried." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She read the note several times, her mind racing. Who had sent it? And what did they mean by buried? She knew the firehouse had its flaws, but this suggested something deeper, something more sinister. David, upon seeing the letter, was immediately concerned. "You need to take this to the police," he said, his voice firm. Sarah hesitated. "What if it's just someone trying to scare me? I don't want to overreact." "Sarah," David said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "this isn't just about you. Whoever sent this is trying to intimidate you, and that's not something we can ignore." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. The next morning, she handed the letter over to the local police chief, a no-nonsense woman named Linda Hayes. Chief Hayes took the threat seriously, promising to investigate and urging Sarah to be cautious. As news of the letter spread, it added a new layer of complexity to the situation. Supporters rallied around Sarah, praising her courage in the face of intimidation, while detractors accused her of exaggerating the threat to gain sympathy. The divide in the town deepened, and the firehouse found itself under even greater scrutiny. Amidst the chaos, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the letter was more than just a scare tactic. She began to dig deeper into the firehouse's history, combing through old records and speaking to longtime residents. What she discovered was both shocking and heartbreaking, a pattern of cover-ups that spanned decades, from mishandled emergencies to instances of workplace harassment that had been swept under the rug. One story in particular stood out. Years earlier, a young firefighter had raised concerns about safety protocols being ignored during training exercises. Shortly after, he had left the firehouse under mysterious circumstances. Sarah tracked down the man, now living in a neighboring town, and persuaded him to share his story. They wanted to protect their image, he told her. And anyone who threatened that, well, let's just say they made it clear you weren't welcome. The revelation added a new sense of urgency to Sarah's mission. This wasn't just about fixing mistakes, it was about uncovering the truth and ensuring accountability for years of wrongdoing. But as Sarah prepared to bring these findings to light, she knew she was walking a dangerous path. The letter had been a warning, and whoever had sent it wasn't going to back down easily. Still, she couldn't let fear stop her. The people of Brookhaven deserved to know the truth, no matter the cost. As she stood on the brink of what could be the most pivotal moment of her journey, Sarah took a deep breath and steeled herself. The battle was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever came next. The morning air was crisp and still as Sarah sat at the committee office, reviewing her latest findings. The weight of the anonymous threat hung over her, but she refused to let it derail her mission. Her focus remained on exposing the systemic issues that had plagued the firehouse for years. Still, she couldn't ignore the nagging thought that whoever had sent the letter might be watching her every move. To keep her work secure, she'd started backing up files to an encrypted drive and only sharing sensitive information with David and Chief Hayes. David had been her anchor through the storm, a steady presence reminding her of her purpose. That morning, he brought her coffee and sat across the table, watching her work with quiet admiration. "Any breakthroughs?" he asked, sipping his own coffee. Sarah nodded. "I found records of a significant budget mismanagement incident from 15 years ago. Funds allocated for equipment upgrades mysteriously disappeared, and the replacements never arrived. The incident was buried under layers of bureaucracy, but I've traced the paper trail back to specific individuals who were involved." David raised an eyebrow. "You think this is connected to the letter?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "But it feels like there's more to this than just bad decisions and arrogance. There's a pattern here, and it's not accidental." Before David could respond, Sarah's phone buzzed. It was Chief Hayes. "Sarah, we've made some progress on that letter," Hayes said. "We've identified fingerprints, but the match isn't in our system. That means it's someone who hasn't been in trouble before, likely local." Sarah frowned. "So someone from Brookhaven. But why go to such lengths to intimidate me? What are they trying to hide?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Hayes replied. "In the meantime, stay cautious. And Sarah, I hope you know what you're doing. This isn't just a political fight anymore, it's personal for someone." Hanging up, Sarah felt the weight of those words. She had known the risks when she started this journey, but now the stakes felt even higher. Still, there was no turning back. The next committee meeting was a turning point. Sarah presented her findings with her usual composure, carefully laying out the evidence of negligence, budget mismanagement, and a culture of intimidation within the firehouse. She highlighted specific incidents, including the mishandled emergency calls and the young firefighter's departure years ago. Her presentation was thorough and damning, and by the end, the room was abuzz with tension. One of the council members, a stern woman named Margaret Hughes, leaned forward. "This is troubling, Sarah. But do you have any proof linking these issues to the current leadership at the firehouse?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Not directly. But the culture hasn't changed, Margaret. The same patterns persist, and the leadership is responsible for setting the tone." The room was silent for a moment, and then a voice from the back spoke up. It was Carl, the veteran firefighter who had been grappling with his own doubts. "She's not wrong," Carl said, standing up. "I've been part of this firehouse for 30 years, and I've seen the good and the bad. We've saved lives, but we've also made mistakes that could have been avoided if we'd held ourselves to a higher standard. Sarah's right to call us out, and maybe it's time we started listening." His words sent a ripple through the room. Carl's admission was unexpected, and it carried weight. For the first time, it felt like real change might be possible. But just as the momentum seemed to shift, the meeting was interrupted by a loud crash from outside. Everyone turned toward the windows, where the sound had come from. Sarah's heart pounded as she and others rushed to investigate. Outside, they found the source of the commotion. Someone had thrown a rock through the window of Sarah's car. Attached to the rock was another note, this one scrawled hastily in black ink. "You've been warned. Stop now." Gasps erupted from the crowd as Sarah stared at the note. The boldness of the act was chilling, a clear message that whoever was behind the threats wasn't afraid to escalate. Chief Hayes, who had been attending the meeting in plain clothes, stepped forward and took the note, her expression grim. "This isn't just intimidation anymore," Hayes said. "It's harassment, and it's criminal. Sarah, you need protection." Sarah shook her head. "I'm not backing down. Whoever this is, they want me to be scared. They want me to stop. But that's not going to happen." The crowd murmured in support, and David stepped up beside her, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll see this through, together," he said firmly. The incident only fueled Sarah's determination. That evening, as she sat at her kitchen table with David and Chief Hayes, they devised a plan to bring everything to light. Sarah would hold a public forum, inviting the entire town to hear her findings. It would be a risky move, but she believed that transparency was the only way to confront the corruption and silence the threats. The days leading up to the forum were tense. Sarah received several more anonymous notes, each more threatening than the last. But instead of deterring her, the threats solidified her resolve. She knew that whatever secrets lay buried in Brookhaven's firehouse, they needed to be unearthed for the good of the community. When the night of the forum arrived, the town's largest auditorium was packed. Residents filled the seats, their faces a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and support. Sarah stood at the podium, her heart pounding but her voice steady as she began to speak. She laid out everything, the mishandled emergencies, the budget discrepancies, the culture of intimidation, and the cover-ups that spanned decades. She named names, backing up her claims with documents and testimonials. The crowd listened in stunned silence, the weight of her words sinking in. But just as she finished, a man in the audience stood up. He was older, with graying hair and a sharp, calculating gaze. Sarah recognized him immediately. It was Frank Dalton, the former fire chief who had overseen the department during some of the incidents she had uncovered. "This is outrageous," Dalton said, his voice dripping with anger. "You're dragging my name through the mud based on half-truths and speculation. I served this town honorably for decades. How dare you?" The tension in the room was electric as Sarah faced him. "I'm not here to tear anyone down, Mr. Dalton," she said. "I'm here to hold people accountable. If you have nothing to hide, you should welcome this investigation." Dalton sneered. "You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? But you have no idea what you're getting into." Before anyone could respond, Chief Hayes stepped forward. "Mr. Dalton," she said, her voice calm but firm, "if you have information to share, I suggest you do it through the proper channels. This isn't the time or place for personal attacks." Dalton glared at Hayes, then at Sarah, before storming out of the auditorium. The room buzzed with whispers as Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Change isn't easy," she said, addressing the crowd once more. "But it's necessary. For all of us. This is about building a better Brookhaven, a community we can all be proud of." The room erupted into applause, and for the first time, Sarah felt a glimmer of hope. The battle was far from over, but she knew she wasn't fighting alone. The aftermath of the public forum was a whirlwind of emotion and activity. The revelation Sarah had presented sent shockwaves through Brookhaven, leaving the town divided but undeniably shaken. While many residents rallied around her, applauding her courage and determination, others were less forgiving. Accusations of exaggeration and vendettas swirled in hushed conversations and heated debates at the diner, the park, and even Sunday services. For Sarah, the days following the forum were relentless. Media outlets from nearby towns picked up the story, and reporters began arriving in droves, eager for interviews. Sarah turned most of them down, choosing instead to focus on the next steps. The anonymous threats hadn't ceased, but they had shifted in tone. The latest note was less menacing and more cryptic, reading simply, "The past won't stay buried forever." Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a warning, it was a clue. With David and Chief Hayes by her side, she doubled down on her research, poring over old newspaper archives, town records, and firehouse logs. It was during one of these late-night sessions that she found it, a small, easily overlooked article from 20 years ago about a fire at an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. The fire had been ruled an accident, but Sarah noticed discrepancies in the official report. Several key details didn't add up, and the incident had been handled by none other than Frank Dalton. "This could be it," Sarah said, her voice tinged with both excitement and dread. "This factory fire, it doesn't make sense. And look at this." She pointed to a list of names in the report. One of them was a man who had recently passed away under mysterious circumstances, a former firefighter who had retired early and moved to another state. David leaned in, frowning. "You think this is what they're trying to hide? Something about that fire?" Sarah nodded. "It's possible. We need to dig deeper." The next day, Sarah and Chief Hayes drove out to the site of the old factory. The building was long gone, replaced by a strip mall, but the land beneath it still held secrets. Hayes had brought along a forensic expert, and with permission from the property owner, they began a preliminary survey. It didn't take long to find something unusual, a patch of soil that had been disturbed and covered with concrete, clearly not part of the original foundation. As the forensic team worked, Sarah felt a mix of anticipation and unease. Hours later, they unearthed a rusted metal box. Inside were charred papers, a melted badge, and what appeared to be fragments of a ledger. The contents were damaged, but some details were still legible, including entries that suggested the firehouse had been involved in illegal activities, using the factory fire as a cover-up. "This is it," Hayes said, holding up a partially burned document. "Proof of corruption. And it goes back decades." But the discovery was only the beginning. As word spread about the unearthed evidence, Brookhaven became a hotbed of speculation and tension. Frank Dalton, now squarely in the spotlight, went on the defensive, denying any wrongdoing and accusing Sarah of fabricating the evidence to destroy his reputation. His supporters rallied behind him, insisting that he was being unfairly targeted. Meanwhile, Sarah received an unexpected visit from Carl. The veteran firefighter looked more worn than usual, his eyes filled with regret. "I need to talk to you," Carl said, his voice low. "There's something you don't know about that fire." "I was there." Sarah's heart raced. "Go on." Carl hesitated, then took a deep breath. "The fire wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. Dalton orchestrated it to cover up a smuggling operation. I didn't know the full extent of what was happening at the time, but I knew enough to keep my mouth shut. I was scared, Sarah. I didn't want to lose my job, or worse." The weight of Carl's confession hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. It was the confirmation she had been searching for, but it also deepened her sense of betrayal. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because I can't live with it anymore," Carl said. And because you're the only one brave enough to stand up to him. With Carl's testimony and the evidence from the factory site, Sarah and Chief Hayes had what they needed to take legal action. Dalton was arrested on charges of corruption, arson, and obstruction of justice, sending shockwaves through the town. The firehouse, now under new interim leadership, began implementing sweeping reforms, including mandatory ethics training and a complete overhaul of its hiring and oversight processes. But the fallout wasn't limited to the firehouse. Dalton's arrest prompted a broader investigation into the town's governance, uncovering a web of corruption that extended far beyond the fire department. Several town officials were implicated, leading to resignations and a special election to rebuild the council. For Sarah, the victory was bittersweet. She had achieved what she set out to do, but it had come at a cost. Some relationships were irreparably damaged, and she still faced hostility from a small but vocal group of residents who blamed her for the town's upheaval. Yet, there were moments of affirmation that reminded her why she had fought so hard. Strangers stopped her in the street to thank her for her courage. Parents expressed gratitude for making the town safer for their children. One evening, as Sarah walked through Brookhaven's town square, she noticed a small gathering by the fountain. It was a community vigil, organized by local youth to honor the firefighters who had served with integrity and to celebrate the changes Sarah had helped bring about. Standing there, surrounded by candlelight and the soft murmur of voices, Sarah felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. David appeared beside her, slipping his hand into hers. "You did it," he said softly. "We did it," Sarah corrected, smiling up at him. As the vigil continued, a young girl approached Sarah, holding a handmade sign that read, "Thank you for being brave." Sarah knelt down, her eyes welling up with tears. "You're welcome," she said, her voice trembling. "And thank you for believing in me." In the weeks that followed, Brookhaven began to heal. The firehouse, once a symbol of division, became a beacon of unity, with new leadership dedicated to earning back the community's trust. Sarah returned to her quieter life, though she remained an active voice in local affairs, ensuring that the progress she had fought for would endure. Looking back, Sarah knew the journey had changed her. She had faced fear, isolation, and uncertainty, but she had also discovered strength she didn't know she possessed. And while the scars of the battle lingered, they were a testament to the power of perseverance and the impact one person could have on a community. As she sat on her porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Sarah reflected on everything that had happened. She couldn't change the past, but she had helped shape a better future for Brookhaven. And for her, that was enough.